Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I know we're at the end of a really interesting day here. So my name is Susan McGregor. I'm an assistant professor at Columbia Journalism School. I'm also have the great fortune to work with Emily Bell at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, whom you all saw host the panel earlier today. This is some work that I did with Elizabeth Ann Watkins, who is a first-year PhD student at Columbia Journalism School. And we wanted to share with you our findings about information security for journalists. So the title of the paper is Security by Obscurity, which any of you who may have a background in or know any computer science folks has special meaning in that community. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, our goal with this work was to understand kind of what's going on with information security with journalists and journalistic organizations. So we all remember the Snowden revelations. Obviously, today the primary topic is the Panama Papers. But this is almost 3 years ago now. It was June of 2013 that the Snowden revelations took place, and of course really changed the landscape for the way that a lot of journalists and the public at large was thinking about the privacy and protection of their communications. We also know about the Sony hack, which I think produced a different kind of anxiety, maybe in organizations beyond journalism organizations. I remember speaking, I've spoken with a lot of people who have sort of said just, how do you run an organization after something like that, where a lot of communications that were taking place that maybe people thought were private have just been exposed to the world in very embarrassing and damaging ways. And of course, the Gawker lawsuit, in which just several months ago, the court ordered that as part of the evidence in this lawsuit, things like the computers, the smartphones, so basically chat histories, email histories of people at Gawker Media could be submitted as evidence. I think that possibly for, given that this is an international audience, I think some of these things are maybe not so surprising or not so new. But what's interesting, what we found interesting was it doesn't seem like much has changed. So while it seems like there's been this big revelation about, how little privacy we actually enjoy in our communications as journalists, how that can challenge our protection of sources, which of course is a major issue for news organizations all over the world and journalists all over the world. It doesn't seem like journalists are doing much differently. So this comes from research that actually Tao had the opportunity to collaborate with the Pew Center on. And what they did about 2 years ago was they asked mostly investigative journalists, actually. So this was a group of journalists that perhaps the first that we would expect to be taking extra precautions with their communications with sources in order to protect those sources and protect their stories. And what was discovered was that, about half of all of the journalists interviewed weren't using 8 of the most common information security tools that are kind of out in the world, the ones that have been around the longest, that are known the best. Less than 40% of them reported changing their methods of communicating with sources since the Snowden revelations. So for the most part, it was sort of business as usual, even though the majority of them believed that the government was surveilling their communications in some way. Similarly, some of the concerns that were high on the list for these journalists, obviously, as has been the case for the industry for quite a long time, decreasing newsroom resources was number 1 in most cases. But number 2 was legal actions against journalists, right? And so kind of the repercussions that we've seen for journalistic sources in the last several years, obviously here in the US, the Obama administration has gained the mantle of having had the most leak prosecutions within its administration than in all previous presidential administrations combined. Obviously, in the U.S., we have some of the most robust press freedom laws, and as Joel Simon noted earlier, we also have generally very robust shield laws for journalists and their sources. What the Snowden revelations, one of the things that it evidenced was that those really aren't enough. So the question that we had was, why haven't things changed more? And one of the ways that we decided to approach this was through the idea of mental models. So mental models is essentially a concept that says that when we think about doing things in the world, and they can be very specific, concrete things, or they can be very abstract things, we kind of have these mental systems that we can kind of put inputs, almost like mental computers that we can put inputs into, and we work them through that process that we have, this mental model, and then we get outputs, and that helps us make decisions about what to do. One of the great scholars on mental models is a very well-known cognitive psychologist named Donald Norman. Many of you may know his work. He's written a lot of great books. This image is actually, it's, I believe, referred to as the masochist's coffee pot, and is the cover of one of his better-known books, The Design of Everyday Things. And it's a great illustration of a mental model, because if you imagine pouring coffee, trying to pour coffee with this coffee pot, it becomes immediately apparent to most of us that you would end up pouring hot coffee onto yourself. So Norman talks about mental models as what people really have in their heads and guides their use of things, right? It's how we think and reason about the world and make decisions about systems with which we interact. So this seemed like a good way to think about it. There seems to be a disconnect between what we know are the risks that journalists face and their sources face, but what journalists are actually doing when it comes to information security. So maybe if we can understand how they're thinking about information security, how journalists are actually thinking about these issues and reasoning about them, it will help us understand where that disconnect comes from. And so we conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews. So, not dissimilar to the kind of journalistic interviews that many of us do on a regular basis, with journalists and editors. So we wanted to kind of build on some previous research to get an idea of also not just how individual journalists think about these issues, but many journalists work in organizations, and how the attitudes of their editors or supervisors played into perhaps how they thought about these things. And we basically used a process whereby you kind of look very closely at the interviews, pay very close attention to the language that people use, and use that to draw out themes. So again, very similar to what we do in kind of a journalistic process. And so two things came out of this. One was that our participants very strongly related the need to information security to the specific beat, geography, or story that they were working on. So they said, well, it depends on where you work and the kind of thing that you're doing, and also that meeting face-to-face was the way to address this. So these are just a few quotes from the participants. I'll let you read them, but the idea is that basically there's this idea that it depends on how sensitive the material is. It depends on how sensitive the source is. If you're on a national security beat, maybe you need to worry about it, but otherwise not really an issue. Or if you think somebody is actively spying on you. And we modeled this, we gave this concept, the idea, the term security by obscurity. And the sense that we got was that journalists perceived that if they weren't working on topics that were controversial or of interest to powerful actors, then they didn't really need to worry about it. They don't really have an information security risk, and that the primary way that they could mitigate that risk was through face-to-face meetings. In computer security literature, security by obscurity gets a really bad rap, because the idea is basically that you're counting on someone not discovering what you're doing, how you're doing your security procedure for security. And of course that works until someone figures it out. And in a sense, that's the case that we found here too. So there's a huge limit to this, because the reality is that actually most security breaches are not the result of a targeted attack. So the fact is that a lot of security compromises come through basic phishing and malware, very unsexy, doesn't have to be you that the person is after. If you're affiliated with a journalism organization, you are not obscure. Okay? A lot of us, we may think, oh, I don't work for a large organization, I'm not publishing anything that's that important, why would anybody be interested in me? The reality is that for the rest of the world, if you are a journalist, you are a prominent figure. If you have, an @newsorganization.com email address, you are necessarily a target. Why does this model persist, though? I mean, if we take this into account, why is it that journalists are thinking that way? Journalists are smart people. They're not just trying to shirk this entirely. Well, what we found was that one of the key things was that we found that a lot of journalists don't really have a clear understanding of the digital communication systems that they're using. So Donald Norman would call this a systems model. How does the thing that I'm interacting with work? And a lot of the people we spoke to were very uncertain about that. The other thing was that without those clear systems models, the easiest thing to do is to just say, you know what, skip it, let's talk in person. Obviously, this is limiting, but it was less costly and more effective. It was a more efficient choice than either learning about the systems models or just foregoing the communication altogether. So this is a quote from one participant about their use of third-party storage, and they say, I've tried to reduce my Dropbox usage, so I've been using a USB stick, which I actually have no idea how safe that is. It seems more safe. This is another quote for someone who is trying to have a sensitive conversation with another manager, and even though the organization has some information security tools available, that person wasn't trained on them, and at the end, the easiest thing to do was simply go and talk to them. So the question about how can we move on from that, right? How can we do things that will actually bring us past this so that we can leverage all of the amazing tools that technology gives us to be able to communicate with sources? I mean, this is an international journalism conference, right? If we were to forego electronic communication with sources, it would sharply narrow the kind of journalism that we're able to do. There's an enormous benefit to having these tools, but we need to be able to use them effectively. And so the main thing, sort of the main recommendation out of this is that we need to improve journalists' understanding of how digital communication tools work so that they can be confident in making decisions that pertain to the information security of their communications, so that they don't have to say, well, I think this seems more safe, or I think this will help. They actually can they can actually use a clear systems model of this to say, I will make this choice because I know it has this benefit. I will use this tool because it offers this protection, and that's the protection that I need in this case. So if we deal with those systems models and engage in direct educational efforts, there seems to be a lot of promise here. This is a somewhat edited quote from one of our participants who said, you know what, who's basically talking about two-factor authentication. And again, I'll let you read this for yourselves, but basically, I have enormous confidence in journalists. The job of journalists is to learn about new things all the time and make sense of them and communicate them to the public. And if that kind of stance is taken with journalists themselves, which is not to say security is too complicated or security is too hard or it's too expensive, but to say, if we clearly explain how these security mechanisms fit into your work, how they protect your work, your colleagues' work, and your sources, then most of the time you will be able to get journalists on board. So thank you very much for your time.